The water had been rising for 3 days before Josephine Hartley put her pen to paper, and she knew, even as she wrote the first careful line, that no one would read it who mattered. That was the nature of her position. Lady Stanhope's companions wrote letters. Solicitors received them. The machinery turned at its own pace, on its own terms, and the fields below the dower cottage went on flooding while the mechanisms of the estate deliberated. She dated the letter the 14th of October, addressed it to Mr. Prentice of Gray's Inn Fields, and described the drainage failure with the same precision she brought to everything she could not afford to leave to chance. She named the field. She measured the standing water by the height it had reached against the gatepost. She noted that the Calvert family's winter seed stores occupied the lower half of their barn, that the barn sat 6 inches below the field's eastern runoff line, and that 11 pounds and 10 shillings of rye and winter wheat would be ruined within a week if the culvert at the north hedge was not cleared. She did not expect to be thanked for this. She expected, at most, that Mr. Prentice would pass the matter to whichever sub-agent had last attended to Ashbourne's lower fields, and that someone would arrive in a fortnight with a spade and a bill. She sealed the letter, gave it to the footman who carried Lady Stanhope's correspondence into the village, and returned to her duties. What she could not have known was that the letter never reached Mr. Prentice at all. The Duke of Ashbourne had been reading his own solicitor's correspondence for 11 months, since the morning he discovered that his former steward, a man named Aldous Crewe, had been falsifying the estate accounts for 4 years. The discovery had arrived not through any dramatic confrontation, but through a single discrepancy in a drainage expenditure on the lower south field, a line item for work that Josephine, had she known this, would have found grimly appropriate. Jonathan Johansen, 9th Duke of Ashbourne, had since adopted the habit of opening all correspondence addressed to Mr. Prentice's office that bore the Ashbourne estate direction. It was not a matter he advertised. It was a scar shaped like a procedure. He opened her letter on the morning of the 15th of October, standing at his study desk in the gray light, still wearing his riding coat. He read it twice. The third time, he read it standing very still, because the letter was not a complaint and not a petition. It was a survey, the water level against the gatepost. The precise location of the culvert blockage, estimated from the surface runoff pattern. The arithmetic of the Calvert family's loss, named to the shilling. Whoever had written it had walked the field. Whoever had written it had looked at the barn and then at the angle of the ground and understood what the angle meant. He was in the saddle within the hour. The lower field in October was the color of pewter, the sky close and unwilling, the ground soft enough that his horse left prints across the headland. He smelled the standing water before he saw it, a green brackish smell that clung to the hedge line and settled in the damp air. The culvert at the north hedge was blocked, as the letter had described, with compacted clay and a summer's worth of dead hawthorn thinnings. 3 of the Calvert tenants were already at work on it with spades, their boots dark to the knee. And at the edge of the field, 1 mile and a quarter from the dower cottage, stood a woman in a gray wool mantle and serviceable boots, holding a drainage survey she had clearly drawn herself, on the back of what appeared to be a piece of household stationery. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the culvert. He dismounted. "You are not Mr. Prentice," she said when she heard him cross the wet grass. She did not look startled, which was interesting. She looked, instead, as if she had correctly identified a complication and was already deciding what to do about it. "No," he said. "Who drew this map?" She looked at him then, a direct and assessing look that no one had leveled at him in recent memory, without first checking his rank. "I did," she said. "From the field surface and the height of the eastern hedge. The culvert mouth is approximately 4 feet below grade on the north side. If your men clear it today, the field drains inside 48 hours. The Calverts can salvage the seed if the barn floor stays dry until Thursday." He said nothing for a moment. He was reading the map. "You are Lady Stanhope's companion," he said. "Josephine Hartley," she said. "Yes." He looked from the map to the culvert to the men working, and then back to her. She had already returned her attention to the field. "Stay," he said, which was not what he had planned to say. "Until the culvert is clear." She stayed. She did not look at him again for the better part of an hour, which was the first time in 11 months that Jonathan had stood beside another person without feeling the constant low-frequency alertness of a man who had been deceived by someone he trusted. It was the kind of detail he noticed only later, when he was back in the saddle and the field was behind him, and the gray sky had begun to thin toward a pale and reluctant afternoon. He had not asked her name a second time, which meant he did not need to. He had learned it the first time and retained it without effort, and he did not examine why. She had not asked him why he had her letter, which meant she had already worked out the answer, or decided the question was not worth the asking. He found this, in a way he could not precisely name, a relief. Josephine returned to the Dower cottage before dark, changed her boots in the passage, and said nothing to Lady Stanhope about the afternoon, because Lady Stanhope was resting, and Josephine saw no reason to introduce a topic that would require explanation and produce anxiety. She said nothing about the Duke of Ashburn either. She had expected coldness in him, or indifference, or the particular brand of territorial annoyance that landowners produced when their estates required attention they had not chosen to give. She had not expected him to read the map. She had not expected him to stand in a wet field for an hour while his own tenants worked. She had not expected the way he had looked at the culvert, with the same focused attention she used when she looked at problems she intended to solve. She put these observations away carefully, in the part of her mind reserved for things she did not intend to revisit. 3 days later, the Calvert family's barn floor was dry. Josephine learned this from Mrs. Fallow, Ashbourne's head housekeeper, who had come to the Dower cottage on estate business and stayed, as she sometimes did, for a cup of tea in the kitchen passage. Mrs. Fallow was a compact woman of 50, with a face like a well-worn map and a precise economy of expression that Josephine recognized as the professional camouflage of a person who sees everything and airs nothing. They had developed, over the 3 months since Josephine's arrival, a cautious mutual regard. "The Duke rode the lower fields himself," Mrs. Fallow said without preamble. "Twice. Spoke to Calvert directly." "I'm glad," Josephine said, and meant it without reservation. Mrs. Fallow set down her cup. "He read your letter 3 times, she said. "Mr. Prentice told me. He does not read letters 3 times. Josephine said nothing. She was thinking about the seed cost, and whether the matter was fully resolved, and whether the culvert would hold through the November rains. She was not thinking about the Duke, who had stood beside her in a wet field and read her map with an attention that felt, she was careful to note, entirely practical. 2 days after that, she went to the Calvert farm. She had £12 in her household purse, her quarterly wage just received. The Calverts had lost £11 and 10 shillings in seed. The arithmetic was simple, and she had done it 3 days running, and she did not intend to think about it any further. She gave the money to Mary Calvert at the kitchen door, framing it as a loan from Lady Stanhope's household fund, which was not precisely true. She said it quietly. She said it once. Mary Calvert pressed her hands and said nothing for a moment, which was its own kind of answer. Josephine walked back along the field path in the late afternoon, her purse light and the sky the color of old pewter. and she felt the particular steadiness that came not from comfort, but from having done what the situation required. She did not see the figure on the gray horse at the upper hedge line. Jonathan had ridden out to check the culvert's drainage channels and had come around the north side of the field at the wrong moment, or the right one, depending on the weight one assigned to things seen in passing. He watched her cross the field path without slowing her pace, her gray mantle against the pale grass, and he understood with the precise clarity of a man who has spent 11 months distrusting his own perceptions that he had not misread her at the culvert. He rode home without speaking to her. He did not tell himself it was nothing. He had learned, at considerable cost, that telling himself things were nothing was the mechanism by which things became disasters. If you have not yet heard Josephine's name in this story, consider leaving a comment below with the moment that first made you lean forward. The story is not finished, and neither is the telling. He said nothing to anyone about what he had seen. He filed the knowledge the way he filed all knowledge that mattered, precisely and in a place where he could find it again. The house party arrived on the 24th of October. 14 guests by Lady Aldermere's count, which was also by Lady Aldermere's design. The Dowager Viscountess Aldermere had been a close friend of Jonathan's late mother, and had translated that intimacy into a sustained conviction that she understood what Ashbourne required better than Ashbourne itself. She had strong opinions about the estate's social obligations. She had a candidate in hand. Miss Cecily Ravenswood was 22, elegant, and polished to a finish so high that the candlelight in the Ashbourne Hall found her from 3 directions at once. She wore her jewels the way a diplomat wears a flag, decoratively and with intent. She had been brought to 6 country gatherings in the past year, and at 5 of them, the right sort of bachelor had found himself inexorably in her vicinity. Lady Aldermere had arranged the dinner table herself. She was also, Josephine noted from the edge of the hall, where she had come to assist Lady Stanhope across the threshold, a woman of considerable acuity who missed very little. Lady Aldermere's gaze had moved across Josephine the evening of her arrival, and had completed a full social inventory in the time it takes to breathe in once. "Lady Stanhope's companion," she said to the woman beside her, in a carrying voice designed to reach the radius of the hallway without appearing to project. Poor creature. Still useful, I suppose, while she's needed. Josephine heard it. She arranged Lady Stanhope's shawl and said nothing. She would not have thought about it further, except that it happened again 3 days later in the Ashbourne drawing-room, where she had come to retrieve Lady Stanhope's embroidery frame. Lady Aldermere was seated with Miss Ravenswood at the south window, and the particular phrase that floated across the room, in that same measured conversational tone, was, "A companion is what one keeps until one is no longer required to keep her." Useful, rather than noticed. Jonathan was not in the room. Josephine picked up the embroidery frame, thanked the footman, and left. She was noticed, she thought, with a dry and private precision, by the exactly correct number of people. The difficulty was that Jonathan kept returning, not pursuing precisely. Not in any way that could be named or reproached. He came to the Dower cottage twice in the following week on estate business connected to the drainage survey, and on both occasions he brought the survey map she had drawn, spread it on the table in the small sitting room, and asked questions that had, she was forced to admit, practical answers she was qualified to supply. The second time, they were both leaning over the table, her finger tracing the line of the upper culvert's proposed extension, and she became aware that he had gone very still in a way that had nothing to do with the map. She straightened. He straightened. Neither of them said anything directly about what had just been present in the room, because there was no Regency convention for naming it without consequence. "You surveyed this from memory," he said, which was an observation, not a question. I walked the field, she said. You walked it twice, he said. The eastern hedge detail is corrected between the first draft and this one. She had not realized he had the first draft. She looked at him. He looked back. And for a moment, the discipline that organized his face settled into something that was not quite different from honesty. I have been reading your letter, he said, since the 15th of October. She thought about this for a moment. It was addressed to Mr. Prentice, she said. Yes, he said. I know. It was in the following days that she began to understand, slowly and against her own considerable resistance, that his attention was not curiosity. It was not the amusement of a man examining an unusual specimen from a safe distance. It was the specific quality of attention that a person gives to something they are in the process of trusting, and which they had not trusted in a long time. She understood this because she recognized the quality. She had worn it herself. What she did not know, and what came to her in fragments over the course of that week, was why he distrusted so carefully. Jonathan did not speak of Aldous Crewe by name in her presence. What he said, one afternoon in the Ashbourne Library, where she had come to return a volume borrowed for Lady Stanhope's recovery reading, was this: that there had been a man in his employ whose competence had appeared absolute, and whose records had appeared impeccable, and who had taken from the Ashbourne tenants 4 years of money that should have gone to field drainage and roof repairs, and the kind of small structural maintenance that keeps a working estate living rather than merely standing. He said this to the window, not to her, his profile against the glass in the gray afternoon light, his jaw held with the specific tension of a man who has decided to say a thing and is in the process of saying it as briefly as the truth allows. The tenants had not known where their money went. They had assumed the estate was indifferent. He had assumed the accounts were correct. By the time I understood, he said, the deficit was considerable, and the trust was not recoverable. She did not say anything consoling. She considered it, and decided it would be the wrong instrument. You read your own solicitor's correspondence now, she said instead. Yes, he said. And so you read mine? Yes. She looked at the volume in her hands. She thought about the letter she had written in the 14th of October, its careful arithmetic, its field measurements, its precise naming of what would be lost if nothing was done. She thought about how it had been written for a solicitor and had reached a duke, and that this entirely accidental chain had its origins in a man's decision never to be deceived at a distance again. The thought sat inside her chest in an odd way. The culvert held, she said, through the first rains. I know, he said. He turned from the window. I checked. The house party's 14th day arrived with a cold clarity that promised frost by nightfall, and with it, Lady Aldermere's campaign reached the conclusion she had been building toward since the carriages unloaded. The Ashbourne drawing-room gathered the assembled guests after dinner, the fire laid deep and the candles high, the kind of domestic arrangement designed to produce the social atmosphere in which certain things could be said in the presence of witnesses. Lady Aldermere had chosen her setting with the same deliberateness she brought to everything. Josephine had come to assist Lady Stanhope, who had insisted on joining the gathering despite the fatigue that had kept her from the last 2 evenings. She sat now in the chair nearest the fire, Josephine at her shoulder, and the room arranged itself around them in the customary way. Miss Ravenswood near the piano, conversation distributed across the settees, Lord and Lady Ashford at the card table, Mr. Prentice standing at the edge of the gathering, a little uncertain of his place. Jonathan was at the far end of the room. Lady Aldermere began in the middle of a sentence, the way people do when they have chosen their moment. She was addressing Lady Ashford, but her voice carried. "Of course, a companion's role is precisely what it sounds like," she said. "A temporary arrangement, suited to temporary circumstances. One would not expect such a person to insert herself into the estate's affairs, however well-meant the intrusion." There was a small, careful stillness in the room. Josephine did not move. "A letter to a solicitor," Lady Aldermere continued, with the pleasant precision of a person applying a blade to an already opened wound. "Written by someone without standing to write it, is the kind of overreach one must address with clarity. The tenants, of course, are the estate's concern, not the companions." Lady Stanhope made a small sound. Josephine pressed her hand, gently, once. She had been told, in various registers and various rooms, that she was outside her authority for the whole of her adult life. She knew the sound of it. She knew what it was designed to produce. She began quietly to prepare herself to leave. Not in panic, not in anger. She would thank Lady Stanhope. She would collect her things from the dower cottage. She had 10 shillings left of her quarterly wage, which was enough to reach the coaching inn and send a letter to her sister in Bath. These were the mechanics of the situation, and she was good at mechanics. Jonathan had not moved from the far end of the room. Then he did. It was not a dramatic crossing. He did not stride. He moved with the specific economy of a man who has decided something and is in the process of carrying it out, and the room felt it before he was halfway across, because rooms feel that quality of intention when it exists. The conversations at the settees paused. The card table went quiet. Miss Ravenswood, at the piano, lowered her hands from the keys. He stopped beside Lady Stanhope's chair. He was facing the room. "Miss Hartley," he said, and his voice was level, in the way that level voices are when they have chosen level as a deliberate register and not a passive one. "Wrote to the estate solicitor on the 14th of October. I read her letter on the 15th. Lady Aldermere's fan did not quite stop its motion. Almost. "I read it 3 times, he said, "because I had not read correspondence of that quality in 4 years of running this estate." She named the culvert. She measured the standing water. She calculated the Calvert family's seed loss to the shilling. She walked 1.25 miles in October mud to stand in a field she had no obligation to stand in, because the situation required someone to stand there. The room was very still. "And then," he said in the same level tone, "she gave her quarterly wages to cover the loss." He looked finally at Lady Aldermere. Mrs. Fallow, who had been standing in the doorway with the restrained attendance of a woman who has spent decades learning exactly how visible to be, took 1 step forward. £11 and 10 shillings, Mrs. Fallow said, with the quiet authority of a person speaking a fact. She told Mary Calvert it was a loan from the household fund. It was not. The fire crackled. Someone near the settee drew a slow breath. Lady Aldermere said nothing. Her fan had stopped. The expression that crossed her face was brief and complicated. The look of a person who has been confident of the terrain for a very long time, and has just discovered that the terrain has been surveyed more carefully than she realized. Miss Ravenswood looked at her hands on the piano keys. Jonathan turned from Lady Aldermere and looked at Josephine. She had not moved. She was standing at Lady Stanhope's shoulder, with her hands folded and her chin level, and the same direct attention she had given him at the flooded field in October, as though she were looking at a situation and deciding what it required. He crossed the last distance between them. "She wrote," he said quietly now, "for the room and for her at once. That a field drains properly or it does not, and that the difference is whether someone looks at the angle of the ground." He paused. 1 beat. "I have been looking at the angle of the ground, Miss Hartley, for 3 months." It was not a long speech. It was not, by the measure of speeches, even a speech at all. It was one irrevocable sentence preceded by two true ones, and the room understood exactly what it was, because rooms understand that quality of irrevocability when it exists. Josephine understood it too. "Your Grace," she said after a moment, in a voice that was steady, and that she kept steady only by a discipline equal to his, "the culvert at the north hedge will require clearing again in February, when the frost breaks." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite what anyone would call a smile. Something quieter than that. Something the room noticed anyway. Because it was the first time in memory the room had seen it. "Yes," he said. "I expect it will." Lady Aldermere departed the following morning, with Miss Ravenswood beside her in the carriage, and the kind of dignified correctness that passes, in certain social circles, for equanimity. She had said to Lady Ashford at breakfast that Ashbourne was a singular establishment, and that she wished the Duke every happiness in his arrangements. She had said it in the tone of a person whose certainty has been gently returned to them, along with their coat and hat. The remaining guests departed over the course of the next 2 days, until Ashbourne settled back into its working quiet. Mr. Prentice called on the morning of the 28th with the drainage survey's formal documentation and 3 items of estate business requiring signature. He found the Duke in the study, reviewed the matters in order, and departed with the satisfied air of a man whose correspondence, for the first time in quite some time, was arriving through the correct channels. Lady Stanhope's health improved markedly in the first week of November, which she attributed to the dry air from the cleared fields, and which Josephine attributed to the fact that Lady Stanhope had begun sleeping through the night again. By the middle of November, Lady Stanhope had written to her niece in Derbyshire to announce that she would winter there, and to her solicitor to arrange the Dower Cottage's seasonal letting. She pressed Josephine's hands on the morning she left, and looked at her with the direct and unsentimental warmth of a woman who has outlived most of her certainties, and kept only the ones that matter. "Stay," she said. "You know the field." Josephine had not asked what she was staying for. She already knew. The first snow came on the 4th of December. In the quiet way of first snows that are not storms, but only announcements, the kind that settles on the grass without urgency and fills the space between the bare beeches with a hush. Josephine saw it from the Ashbourne Library, where she had been reviewing the correspondence schedule with Mrs. Fallow, and where she had spent, in the weeks between Lady Stanhope's departure and the estate's gradual acclimatization to her continued presence, more quiet hours than she had yet counted. The library was a good room. It had 3 tall windows facing the north garden, a fire that the footman kept banked well without being asked, and shelves that ran from the floor to the ceiling with the confident disorganization of a collection that has been actively used rather than decoratively arranged. Josephine had found, on the 3rd shelf from the left, 2 volumes on land drainage that were so marked with penciled annotation that they had taken her a week to read properly, because the annotations were more interesting than the text. The annotations were Jonathan's. She had known this before she confirmed it, the same way she had known, at the flooded field in October, that the man who dismounted and read her map without introduction was not the kind of man who would hand it back without understanding it first. He came in while the snow was still falling, his coat carrying the cold from outside in the particular way that outdoor cold inhabits wool, a specific and not unpleasant sharpness. He stopped when he saw her at the window. "It is early for snow," she said. "It is," he said. He did not take off his coat. He was looking at her in the gray-white light that the snow threw back into the room, a quality of attention that she had, by now, stopped trying to catalogue as anything other than what it was. She turned from the window. On the desk between them, where she had set it when she came in, and where she had not quite managed to set it aside all afternoon, lay his letter. Not Mr. Prentice's letter, not Lady Stanhope's letter, not an estate matter at all. A letter in his hand, delivered to the Dower cottage 3 days before Lady Stanhope's departure, opened and read and folded and unfolded until the creases knew her hands. He had not asked for an answer. He had written, "I am not asking you to decide quickly. I am only asking you to decide." She had spent 3 days deciding. She looked at him now, in the library with the snow outside and the fire behind her, and the folded letter on the desk, and she thought about what she had understood at the flooded field, and understood more clearly in each subsequent week. That this man's attention was not a passing weather. It was a judgment carefully made by someone who had learned, at considerable cost, the difference between the appearance of trustworthy and the substance of it. He had read her letter 3 times. He had ridden to the field. He had stood in the mud and read her map without condescension and without instruction, as a person reads a thing they intend to rely on. She had given her wages to the Calverts because the situation required it, and because she could not do otherwise without being someone smaller than herself. He had named that, in the drawing room, not as a performance, but as a proof, and the distinction mattered enormously. She picked up the letter. She held it for a moment, the paper still carrying the exact warmth of the desk, and looked at him. "The North Culvert," she said, "will require clearing in February." "Yes," he said. "You have mentioned it." "I mention it," she said, "because I intend to be here in February, if you will have me." He crossed the room. He stopped close enough that she could see the particular expression that had formed in the drawing room at the corner of his mouth, and that was present again now in a form that she might, if she were being precise about it, describe as the same held winter light the snow was sending through the window, something that had been waiting for the right conditions. He took the letter from her hand. He set it on the desk. "Miss Hartley," he said, "I have had the estate surveyed by 3 different men in the past 4 years. Not one of them measured the standing water against the gatepost." "It is a straightforward observation," she said. "It is not," he said. "It requires looking at the gate and the water at the same time, and understanding what the relationship between them means." She was quiet for a moment. The fire settled in the grate behind her. "I have been told," she said carefully, "that I observe too closely, that it is an inconvenient quality in a companion." "It is," he said, "the quality I cannot do without." The snow outside the window was thickening, covering the north garden's bare beds, collecting in the angles of the stone balustrade, filling the distance between the house and the beech trees with a white and patient quiet. The folded letter rested on the desk between the drainage survey, the estate correspondence for December, and the 2 annotated volumes on land management, its edges worn soft with 3 days of handling. Mrs. Fallow, who had returned to the library with the afternoon's post and had reached the doorway at precisely the wrong moment, or the right one, withdrew without sound, with the long-practiced discretion of a woman who has spent 30 years understanding the difference between what requires witnessing and what requires privacy. The fire burned steadily. The snow went on falling. Josephine Hartley, who had spent the whole of her adult life being told she was useful rather than noticed, who had written a letter about a drainage culvert to a solicitor who never received it, who had walked 1.25 miles in October mud because the field required someone to stand in it, stood in the Ashbourne Library in December with the first snow of the season outside the window, and understood with the same precision she brought to everything she could not afford to leave to chance, that she had been seen. Not eventually. Not despite herself. Entirely. The library was warm, and the letter was on the desk, and the Northfields culvert would need clearing in February, and she would be there to see it done. If Josephine's quiet courage in this story moved you, leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you longest. It helps more people find stories like this one.